If your wife yelled, "Accept my friendship with my ex or forget me," and you left by morning, what would you do when her nonstop texts made you realize you don't recognize her anymore? My name is Nolan Price, and I learned the hard way that an ultimatum is just a confession with better lighting. She yelled that I had to accept her friendship with her ex or forget her, and something in me went quiet in the exact way a door goes quiet when it clicks shut, because there is no debate after a click. I replied, "Easy choice, honey, not because I wanted to win an argument, but because I wanted to end the performance." The line landed like a slap without the mess, and her face changed fast, from righteous to offended to scared, like she had expected me to beg, and I had skipped the begging part entirely. That was the moment I realized she did not want a husband, she wanted a witness who signed off on her story. I had spent months watching her practice that story in small ways, polishing it on friends, sanding down any edge that made her look guilty, and now she was demanding my signature on the final draft. I did not pack like a man planning revenge, and I did not pack like a man planning forgiveness. I packed like a man stepping off a sinking ship without looking for a violin. I took 2 changes of clothes, my work boots, my documents, and the small folder I keep for anything that might matter later, which is a habit you develop when your job teaches you that people lie better than pipes leak. I did not slam drawers, I did not throw anything, I did not make a scene for her to replay later as proof that I am unstable. I moved through our bedroom with careful hands and an even face because calm is a kind of armor, and sarcasm is the buckle that keeps it tight. She followed me, saying things fast, changing angles like a lawyer who has not found the right judge yet, and when none of it landed, she tried a softer voice, like softness can erase what she already said. I kept my eyes on the zipper of my bag, because if I looked at her too long, I might believe the version of her that used to be true. The door closed behind me with that same clean click, and the hallway smelled like someone's late-night cooking and cheap laundry detergent, which was perfect because reality always has a smell and fantasy does not. The elevator took its time, as if the building itself wanted to give me a second chance to be weak, and I almost laughed at that because even the machinery in my life seemed trained to test me. On the ground floor, the lobby lights were too bright, and the security camera over the mailboxes watched me like it had opinions. I nodded at it anyway, not as a joke, but as a reminder to myself that I was not going to do anything I would regret seeing later. Outside, the air was cold enough to feel honest, and my breath looked like proof. By the time I got to my car, my phone was already vibrating again, the relentless little insect that thinks noise equals power. I did not answer, and that mattered because there are 2 kinds of men when a woman starts pressing every button she can find, and I decided a long time ago that I would not be the kind that rewards panic with attention. I drove to a cheap hotel near the edge of town, the kind with a front desk that never smiles and a carpet that has seen worse than me, and I checked in without telling anyone why. The room was small and clean enough, and the bedspread had that stiff, floral pattern that tries to distract you from the fact that you are alone. I set my bag down, washed my face, and stared at my reflection until my eyes stopped looking surprised. I did not feel heroic, and I did not feel broken. I felt done. Her messages kept coming in waves, first angry, then pleading, then angry again, like she was cycling through personalities to see which one I missed the most. I read enough to understand the strategy and not enough to absorb the poison. She talked about love, then disrespect, then partnership, then cruelty, then how her ex was only a friend, then how I had always been insecure, then how I was abandoning her, then how she could not live without me. It was impressive in a way, like watching someone juggle knives and swear the blades are safe. I did not reply because anything I said would become part of her narrative, and I was not donating lines to a script I did not write. Sometime after midnight, my phone flashed again, and even without unlocking it, I saw a lock screen preview that made my stomach do a small, controlled drop. A name I had seen in her life before, the X, sitting there on my screen like a stain that had finally shown through the fabric. The message preview was short, the kind that assumes comfort and routine, the kind that does not explain itself because it does not have to. I did not need the full message to understand the tone. The preview alone carried the weight of familiarity. For a second, I just stared at it, because the human brain loves denial, and mine tried to offer it up like a coupon. Then I did what I always do when I sense a lie trying to become history. I documented the moment. I took a screenshot of the lock screen preview, and I made sure the time was visible, because time is the only witness that never takes sides. I saved it to a folder I had never wanted to create, one I had always considered paranoid, and yet there it was, forming in my hands like something inevitable. I labeled the screenshot with the date, because later, when people start arguing about feelings, the date will still be sitting there like a deadbolt. The act of saving it did not feel like spying. It felt like refusing to be gaslit. She had thrown an ultimatum at me, and the world had answered with a timestamp. I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the distant sounds of other lives being lived badly in nearby rooms. I thought about her yelling, and I thought about how casual she was with cruelty, how she framed her demand as a boundary, as if boundaries are supposed to trap the other person and not protect the one setting them. Accept my friendship with my ex, or forget me. It was a neat line, sharp and clean, and it had been building in her for a while. She had been testing it in smaller ways, dropping his name in conversation like a coin on a table, waiting to see if I flinched, and when I didn't flinch, she pushed harder, as if my calm was an insult. Now she had finally said the quiet part out loud, and I had responded the only way a man can respond if he wants to keep his self-respect intact. Morning came slowly, and I did not sleep much, because anger is caffeine and betrayal is a broken alarm clock. I got up before sunrise, showered, and dressed like I was going to work, because routine is the last thing you own when someone tries to rewrite your life. My phone had a wall of notifications, and I scrolled just enough to confirm the pattern. Non-stop, urgent, escalating, no real accountability, plenty of blame. She was not asking what she had done. She was asking what I was going to do about it. That tells you everything you need to know about a person, and it tells you even more when you realize you used to be the one doing the fixing. I went to the building early because people talk more in the morning when they are half awake and less careful. The lobby was quiet except for the soft whir of the vending machine and the clack of someone's shoes in the distance. I walked in with my work keys in my pocket and my face set to neutral, the expression I use when a tenant complains about a leak they caused. I could feel eyes, even when I did not see them, because rumor has a smell too, and it was already thick. Someone had probably heard her yelling through a shared wall, or seen me with a bag, or caught the energy of it through the thin social fabric that holds buildings together. In places like this, privacy is a theory and gossip is a utility. On my way to the office, I passed the mailroom, and my phone buzzed again. Another message, another demand, another attempt to pull me into a fight where she could claim I started it. I did not answer. I stared at the phone, then at the glass door to the lobby, and I pictured her standing there, breathless, trying to corner me in public so she could control the scene. That was the thing about her now, or maybe the thing about her that I had ignored before. She always wanted an audience when she thought it would benefit her, and she always wanted privacy when the truth was about to land. I was not going to give her either one on her terms. I went upstairs, logged into my work computer, and handled the normal tasks that keep a building from turning into a complaint museum. In between, my mind kept circling back to that lock screen preview, the little slice of truth that had slipped out while she was busy flooding me with noise. It was almost funny, in a dark way, how often liars lose control because they rely on volume instead of precision. They assume they can drown reality, but reality does not drown, it just waits. The more she texted, the more she revealed her need to control me, and the more I recognized that need as something separate from love. Love does not threaten to erase you if you do not accept humiliation. Around mid-morning, I stepped into an empty stairwell and opened the screenshot again, zooming in on the time, the name, the fragment of words. I did not feel like a detective, and I did not feel like a victim. I felt like an accountant of truth, balancing a ledger that someone else had been cooking for months. I knew better than to build a case on one fragment, because one fragment can be explained away, spun, laughed at, dismissed as misunderstanding. What you need is a pattern, and patterns are built from small pieces, gathered calmly, filed neatly, and presented without emotion. I have seen enough conflicts explode because one person brought rage instead of proof. Rage is easy to dismiss. Proof is heavy. I texted her one message, the only one I plan to send for now, because silence is powerful, but sometimes a single line is a boundary that stands taller than a wall. I asked who she was, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact, because the woman who had married me would never have demanded I accept a humiliation as the price of staying. I did not add anything else. No lecture, no threats, no bargaining. One question, clean and cold. Then I put the phone away like it was a tool and not a leash. Minutes later, her reply came fast, and I did not open it. I did not need the words to know the tone. I could already predict the arc. Outrage that I dared to question her identity, pain that I dared to leave, anger that I dared to refuse her terms, then some soft language meant to lure me back, then anger again when I did not comply. That cycle had been living in our marriage longer than I wanted to admit. The only difference now was that I had stepped off the ride. By noon, the first real consequence hit in a small, harmless way that still carried teeth. A resident I usually chat with in the hallway gave me a tight smile and looked past me, as if I had become inconvenient. Someone else said my name like a question, stretching it out in the air, testing whether it would attract more information. I kept my tone polite and my answers short, because I was not going to feed the machine. Let them starve on silence. Let them learn the difference between rumor and record. I went back to the office, pulled out a notebook, and wrote a simple header at the top of a blank page. Evidence ledger. I did not write a manifesto. I did not write a diary. I wrote a table, because feelings can be denied, but tables have a way of staying put. Under that header, I listed the date, the time, and the first item. Lock screen preview screenshot, X's name visible, time visible. Next to it, I wrote one line about context, nothing more. I signed the page at the bottom because I wanted every part of this to be clean, like a chain of custody for my own sanity. I was not planning to ruin her with one dramatic moment. I was planning death by 1,000 truths, delivered calmly, each one too small to look like malice, and together impossible to dismiss. As I capped my pen, my phone buzzed again and again and again, and I watched the screen light up in the dim office like a pulse that did not belong to me anymore. The irony was almost sweet. She had demanded that I accept her ex's presence in our life as if it were harmless. Now she was proving she could not accept my absence for even a day without losing control. If she wanted a lesson, she was about to get one, and it would not be loud. It would be quiet, procedural, and final. That afternoon, I drove back to the hotel, not because I was afraid to go home, but because home had become her stage, and I did not do encore performances. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the screenshot one more time, and felt something settle into place behind my ribs. It was not rage, and it was not heartbreak. It was clarity, the kind that makes you dangerous without making you reckless. I thought about her ultimatum, and I thought about my answer, and I realized that leaving by morning had not been the first move of revenge. It had been the first move of survival, and survival, when done right, looks a lot like victory. I turned the phone face down because the glow was starting to feel like a taunt, and I stared at the blank wall, already planning the next small truth I would collect, already knowing that the real fight would not be between me and her, but between her story and the record. And as the room went quiet, I understood something that should have been obvious from the start. She did not just want me to accept her friendship with her ex, she wanted me to accept a new version of reality, one where my dignity was optional. I had made my choice, honey, and now the only question left was how many people would watch her lose hers. By the second night, the hotel room stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like a decision with a lock on it. I hated that more than the loneliness, because loneliness is honest, but a lock suggests you're being held. I kept telling myself I wasn't hiding, I was refusing her stage, yet the distinction did not comfort my nervous system at 3 a.m. when the phone lit up again and again like a siren trying to shame me back into my own life. I left the phone face down on the nightstand, then I flipped it over anyway, because discipline is not a wall, it is a muscle, and mine was sore. The screen was stacked with her messages, and I could tell from the pattern alone that she was chasing something more than reconciliation. She was chasing control of the timeline, control of the first story people heard, control of which version of me would be passed around like a cigarette in the lobby. She had always cared about optics, but lately it was as if optics were the only relationship she could maintain without effort. I did not open her texts, I opened my own banking app instead, because if she wanted me to accept humiliation as normal, then normal was going to start leaving footprints. I owned the shared discretionary card, not because I was generous, but because it was easier, and because a marriage is supposed to be a shared thing, not a surveillance system. Now, in a dark little room with a floral bedspread and a heater that rattled like an old man clearing his throat, I scrolled through transactions with the same calm I used when a tenant swore a leak was sudden, even though the ceiling stain said it had been crying for weeks. At first, everything looked ordinary enough to be boring. Grocery store, gas, a pharmacy run, a small online purchase that could have been mine, could have been hers, could have been nothing. Then the pattern started to show itself in the places patterns like to hide, not in the big dramatic charges that scream, but in the repeated small ones that whisper. A restaurant I did not like. At times she always claimed she was just running errands. A boutique coffee spot across town where she had no reason to be, unless you count meeting someone who knows your lies by first name as a reason. A parking garage fee at a location that made no sense with her stated route. The kind of fee you pay when you want to be unseen, even though paying for unseen is still paying. The most telling part was not the money, it was the timing. I started writing times down, not in a diary way, but in a functional way, like I was mapping a building's maintenance calls. Tuesdays and Thursdays, late afternoon. Saturdays, mid-evening, always just after she would send me a little message about how busy she was, how tired she felt, how she wished I were more supportive. She had been building a narrative of martyrdom on the same days she was funding something else. My phone chimed with a merchant alert while I was still staring at the ledger, and I felt my mouth go dry in a slow, controlled way. A new charge, fresh, like she was daring me to watch. The alert showed the merchant name and the amount, and it was one of those amounts that screams, 2 people pretending it's not a date, not one person grabbing a sandwich. I took a screenshot of the alert and saved it immediately, then I sat there holding the phone like it was a hot tool, because I could feel the temptation to do something impulsive, to send it to her with a caption that would cut. That's what she wanted. She wanted me loud, she wanted me messy, she wanted me to react in a way that could be clipped, forwarded, and summarized by someone who already disliked my calm. A man who stays quiet forces people to ask questions. A man who explodes answers those questions for them, and the answer is always the same. He was the problem. So I breathed, slow and deep, until the room felt bigger again, and then I built the proof the way I build anything that needs to last. I wrote the date and time on paper, I logged the merchant alert screenshot, I noted the amount, I noted the location tied to the merchant, because merchants have addresses and addresses have a way of contradicting cover stories. I didn't need a confession, I needed a map. The next morning I went back to the building early, not because I was eager, but because routine was still my anchor, and anchors keep you from drifting into stupidity. The lobby was louder than usual, even without sound, because people find ways to communicate with facial muscles alone. The older woman from Unit 4B, who used to greet me warmly, gave me a thin smile and turned her head slightly, like she was protecting her mouth from saying the wrong thing. The young guy from 8A, who always asked about package deliveries, looked me over with curiosity that felt rehearsed, as if he had been given a set of rumors and was checking the casting. I walked straight through like I belonged there, because I did. Leaving my wife overnight did not revoke my right to exist. If anything, it sharpened it. I handled work orders, checked the boiler room, answered maintenance requests, and kept my voice steady. Because steady voices make people uneasy when they are hungry for drama. At some point, I noticed a new HOA notice on the board near the mailboxes, printed in that sterile tone people use when they want their cruelty to look official. It wasn't directed at me by name, but it didn't have to be. It was about unauthorized storage, compliance review, procedural reminders, the kind of paperwork that says, "We're watching you," without admitting who "we" is. I knew who it was. Grant Vale didn't need to stand in front of me to swing at me. He could swing with fonts and signatures and the smug comfort of a committee title. That was his kind of masculinity, the kind that wears a badge and calls it virtue. I took a photo of the notice and walked away without ripping it down, because ripping it down would have been emotional, and emotion is the currency of people like him. Let it hang, let it be seen, let it establish that he was suddenly interested in rules right after my wife told me to accept him. In my office, I opened my notebook and added the merchant alert screenshot to the evidence ledger. Then I wrote one line beneath it. Charge time conflicts with stated errands window. I kept it dry, I kept it cold, I kept it useful. She called around lunchtime. I didn't answer. She called again. I still didn't answer. Then a voicemail notification appeared, and for a second I considered listening, not because I needed it, but because curiosity is a little addiction and betrayal feeds it. I resisted. Curiosity is how people get dragged back into rooms they swore they left. I had already learned the biggest truth of this situation. Her voice was not a tool for truth anymore. It was a tool for pressure. Instead, I did something simple. I went to the bank branch where I had opened the account years ago, the one with the same gray carpet and the same polite, tired clerks who had seen every kind of domestic disaster and learned to keep their eyebrows still. I didn't walk in asking for revenge. I walked in asking for a printed transaction summary for my own account, because that is not dramatic. It is normal. People request printouts every day. People request printouts when they lose passwords, when they apply for rentals, when they plan budgets, and people request printouts when they suspect their spouse is using their money to live a second life. The clerk printed a clean list of recent transactions and slid it across the counter with the kind of neutral expression that tells you they know, but they won't say they know. I thanked them, folded the paper carefully, and left. Outside, I took a photo of the printout next to the date on my phone screen, because digital proof is good and paper proof is better, and combined they become annoying to dismiss. I was building something that would not rely on my tone, or my mood, or my ability to persuade a room. I was building something that would stand on its own, like a pillar that doesn't care who likes it. Back at the hotel, I spread the printout and my notebook on the bed like I was arranging evidence for my own sanity. The restaurant charge was there, right where the alert had shown it. The coffee spot charges from previous weeks were there too, repeating in a way that made my skin crawl, because repetition is intimacy. Repetition means this wasn't a one-time mistake. Repetition means a routine. Repetition means she had been practicing lying to my face until it felt easy. I tried to picture the moments she had lied. The way she had looked at me with tired eyes and told me she needed space, needed time, needed support. The way she had kissed my cheek in the morning as if we were still a team, then walked out carrying a small purse with a phone that would light up for someone else. The memory didn't make me cry. It made me clear. Sadness was too expensive for a woman who had already spent my dignity like loose change. That evening I drove past the restaurant on the printout. Not to confront anyone, not to stalk, not to do anything illegal or ridiculous, but because I needed to understand the geography of my own marriage. The place sat on a corner with a neat little patio and warm lights that made it look safe, like a lie with ambiance. I didn't park in front. I didn't sit there watching. I kept moving, slow enough to note the layout. Then I drove away. I wasn't hunting her. I was mapping the battlefield she dragged into my life. When I got back to the hotel, my phone was buzzing again, but now her messages had shifted, and the shift itself told me she had noticed the change in power. Earlier, she had been furious that I left. Now she was furious that I wasn't responding. Rage demands an audience. Silence starves it. Then, right as I set the phone down, another lock screen preview flashed. This time, it wasn't her. It was a notification from a shared cloud album we had never bothered to separate because we had trusted the concept of us. A memory reminder, cheerful and innocent, offering to show me a moment from this day, as if the app was a friend trying to brighten my mood. The thumbnail was small, but my brain caught enough to stiffen my shoulders. It looked like a photo from a community event, the kind of event where people smile for public reasons. And in the blur of the tiny preview, I saw a shape that felt familiar in the worst way. A shoulder line, a haircut, a stance that carried confidence like entitlement. I opened the album, and my thumb hovered over the screen like it was deciding whether to touch fire. The memory reminder wasn't proof yet. It was a door, and I had learned that doors in my life now opened into rooms where she kept different versions of herself. I tapped the reminder anyway, because I wasn't afraid of truth. I was afraid of what I would do without it. The photo loaded slowly, then sharpened, and my stomach settled into that cold, hard place again. The date attached to it was older than it should have been, and the location tag was not where she had claimed she was on that day, not even close. The faces in the photo were smiling, innocent in that posed way that says, "Nothing to see here." And there he was, closer than a friend should be, positioned like someone who belonged. The worst part wasn't the image. It was the way the app presented it like a gift, wrapped in nostalgia, because nostalgia is how betrayal hides in plain sight. I stared at the date, then at the location tag, then back at the date again, because my mind was already comparing it to the times in my ledger, and I could feel the pattern tightening like a noose. I saved screenshots of the metadata screen, not just the photo itself, because photos can be argued about, but metadata is a quiet judge. I wrote the date and location into my notebook. I added a new line beneath my merchant alerts. Shared cloud memory shows older contact and proximity. My handwriting stayed neat. My pulse didn't. I sat back and let the sarcasm rise, because if I didn't let it rise, something uglier might. So this was her friendship, I thought. The kind that left footprints in my bank account and shadows in our shared memories. The kind that demanded my blessing while it quietly stole my reality. The kind that called me controlling when all I had asked for was respect. My phone buzzed again with a new message from her, and for the first time that day, I considered reading it. Not because I missed her, but because I wanted to measure how well she understood the situation she created. I opened it, and the first line was not an apology. It wasn't even a question. It was another demand dressed up as pain. Another attempt to drag me into her version of events. I locked the screen, set the phone down, and looked at the evidence spread across the bed. A bank printout, a screenshot folder, a cloud album metadata capture, a notebook with dates written in ink like small gravestones. It still wasn't enough to destroy a liar, but it was enough to make a liar nervous, and nervous liars make mistakes. I stared at the hotel ceiling again, the same blank surface that had watched me choose calm over chaos, and I felt something shift, subtle but permanent. This wasn't going to be a private argument between spouses. Grant Vale had already turned it into a public pressure campaign, using HOA paper like a cudgel. Evelyn had already tried to turn it into a moral trial where I was the villain for refusing her terms. If they wanted a public story, then fine. I would give them one, but not with shouting, not with threats, and not with a desperate speech. I would give them a record. And as I reached for my notebook to add one more line, a new notification appeared at the top of the screen, brief and sharp, and it made the room feel colder than the heater could fix. An HOA agenda update for the next meeting, with my building and my name implied between the lines, and the kind of timing that told me Grant was moving the stage under my feet. I smiled once, without warmth, because now I understood the game. They were trying to corner me in public and force an emotional response. They were trying to make me react like a stereotype so they could win by labeling me, but I wasn't going to react. I was going to arrive with documents and let the room do what rooms always do when faced with time-stamped truth. By the time I turned the phone off and set it aside, I already knew the next piece I needed, and I knew exactly where it would come from, because the ledger was pointing me there, and her lies were starting to overlap in ways even charm couldn't smooth over. The day I went to the courthouse, I did not feel dramatic, and that bothered me more than it should have, because I expected a moment like that to come with thunder. Instead, it came with a weak winter sun and a line of tired strangers shuffling toward a metal detector like we were all trying to confess something at the same speed. I had slept 3 hours, drank bad coffee, and stared at my evidence ledger until the dates started looking like a second language, and still, when I stood there holding a plain folder with plain paperwork, my hands were steady in a way that felt almost rude. If she wanted a love story, she shouldn't have issued ultimatums. If she wanted a war, she shouldn't have assumed I was loud. I chose this courthouse because it was the closest one that handled the filings I needed without making it an all-day event, and because I knew, deep down, that convenience can be a shield. People do not expect decisive moves to happen in the most boring places, and nothing on earth is more boring than government carpeting and fluorescent lighting. I parked far enough away to avoid the cluster of people near the entrance, not because I feared being seen, but because I wanted to arrive as a man with a task, not as a man hunting for sympathy. The security line moved slowly, the kind of slow that makes you feel every thought you have been avoiding. Ahead of me, a woman with a baby carrier shifted her weight and looked like she had already fought 10 battles that morning. Behind me, an older man held a stack of papers so thick it made his wrists look tired. No one looked excited. No one looked proud. This was a place where life's private failures became public records, and everyone behaved like they knew the building could hear them. I kept my folder pressed against my chest and watched the guard wave people through, making the same gestures with the same face, indifferent to every story in that line. That indifference, strangely, calmed me. It reminded me that my marriage was not special enough to deserve a spectacle. And that was useful. Spectacles are for people who need witnesses. Records are for people who need results. When I stepped up, I emptied my pockets, placed my keys in the tray, and passed through the detector without setting anything off. It felt like an omen. I was not carrying anything that could be used against me, not physically, not emotionally, not legally, and that was the point. I collected my things, walked into the main hall, and immediately felt the air change, because courthouses have a particular smell. A mix of paper, stale coffee, and the kind of quiet fear people try to hide with polite voices. I headed toward the clerk's window, reading signs like a man who didn't want to ask for directions, because asking for directions in places like this can start conversations you do not need. The hallways were full of small groupings, people whispering, people staring ahead, people pretending they weren't watching other people's collapses. I stayed in my lane, eyes forward, folder tight. Halfway there, my phone buzzed, and I glanced down out of habit, expecting another wave of texts from Evelyn. Instead, the screen showed a missed call, then another, all in a row, like she was trying to drill through my silence with repetition. I did not call back. I did not text back. I did something better. I turned the phone off entirely because I did not want even a vibration to shape my decisions in a building built for decisions. At the clerk's office, the line was shorter, but the waiting felt heavier because the people there carried documents the way you carry broken glass. I stood behind a man in a wrinkled suit who kept rubbing his forehead, and I stared at the posted instructions on the wall until the words blurred into a single message. Be precise, be calm, do not waste the clerk's time. It was advice for a filing and for a divorce. When I reached the window, I slid my folder forward with a polite nod, and I spoke in the same tone I use when I schedule a contractor, a tone that says, I understand process and I respect it. I asked for the filing, I confirmed the fee, I signed where I needed to sign, and I kept my face neutral even when the clerk glanced at my name and then at me as if weighing my expression against my paperwork. Clerks see 1,000 versions of grief, but they only stamp one thing, what is in front of them. The stamp landed on the top page with a dull, final thud, and that sound did more to settle my stomach than any conversation could have. Received, date, time, a clean mark of reality. The clerk slid the stamped copy back through the slot, and for a second I just held it, feeling the texture of the ink and the weight of its meaning. It was not a victory, not yet, but it was a line in the sand that could not be rewritten by charm. I stepped away from the window and moved toward an empty corner near a bulletin board, not to hide, but to create space for the next action without blocking anyone else's path. I took out my phone, turned it back on, waited for it to wake, and then held the stamped page up beside the lock screen date and time. I took a clear photo, then another, because redundancy is not paranoia, it is survival. Then I slid the paper into a clear sleeve I had brought, not because I wanted to be theatrical, but because I wanted the document protected the way you protect anything you might need to prove later. I was halfway through putting everything back into my folder when I felt the shift in the air that happens when someone enters your orbit with urgency. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the courthouse amplifying my instincts, but then I heard the quick rhythm of shoes on tile behind me, and a familiar tension tightened my shoulders before I even turned. Evelyn was there. Not a coincidence. Not a casual sighting, not a random overlap. She had tracked the day, tracked the timing, or tracked the idea that a man who refuses to answer texts might still be predictable in his next move. She looked put together in the way she always did when she wanted to look wronged rather than guilty. Hair neat, coat tailored, eyes bright with a kind of controlled emotion that can be photographed well. She was not here to reconcile. She was here to stage a moment. I did not greet her. I did not flinch. I simply held my folder tighter and kept my expression blank. Because blank faces are mirrors, and mirrors make performers uncomfortable. She moved closer, and I could see her scanning my hands, my papers, my posture, trying to read what I had done. She was smart enough to know that paper means escalation. She was also arrogant enough to believe she could still control my response. She started talking fast, and even without listening to every word, I recognized the strategy, the way she stacked accusations and pain and nostalgia into a single breath, hoping I would grab one piece and argue with it. She wanted to pull me into a private fight inside a public building because then my calm would look like cruelty and my refusal to engage would look like guilt. It was a trap built from optics, not truth. I let her speak until she ran out of breath, and then I responded in the simplest possible way. Because simple truths are hard to twist. I told her I would not discuss anything here, and I would not discuss anything without written channels. I told her that if she needed to communicate, she could do it properly. I did not raise my voice. I did not call her names. I did not insult her ex. I gave her nothing she could clip and sell. That restraint did what restraint always does to a person used to controlling the room. It made her desperate. Her expression shifted, then shifted again, flickering between anger and panic, as if she couldn't decide which face would move me. She tried a softer approach, reminding me of history, of shared plans, of the version of us she wanted to keep alive in public, even as she killed it in private. It was almost convincing, which is exactly why I refused to entertain it. A convincing lie is more dangerous than an obvious one. People nearby began to glance over, not fully staring, but noticing, the way humans always notice conflict in places built for conflict. Evelyn seemed to sense the attention and lean into it, modulating her voice into something that sounded wounded rather than aggressive. I could almost see her shaping a narrative in real time. Abandoned wife, confronting cold husband. It would play well in a building full of strangers who never see the start of a story, only the scene in front of them. I kept my hands visible. I kept my body angled away, not defensive, just closed. I did not step closer. I did not touch her. I did not block her path. I behaved like someone who understood that the biggest danger in a courthouse is not a guard with a detector. It is a spouse with a story. She took a half step forward, and I took a half step back, and that tiny movement mattered more than any words, because it showed, quietly, that I was not there to fight. If anyone asked, the physical record would match the emotional record. I was leaving a conversation I did not consent to. A security guard glanced in our direction, then started to approach. Not aggressive, just attentive, the way they do when they sense a scene forming. Evelyn noticed him and changed tactics again, as if the presence of a uniform made her reconsider how she wanted to be perceived. She shifted into outrage about fairness, about how I was doing this to her, about how I was turning strangers into judges. It was all performance. It was also, ironically, proof of exactly what I had felt for months. She needed the audience more than she needed the truth. When the guard arrived, he didn't accuse anyone. He simply asked if everything was fine and if we needed to move along. Evelyn tried to speak first, of course, but I answered with calm clarity and minimal detail, because minimal detail keeps you safe. I told him there was no problem, that we were done, and that I was leaving. I did not point at her. I did not say she was harassing me. I did not ask for help. I simply ended the interaction and walked away, letting my feet do what my voice refused to do, give her the fight she wanted. I headed toward the exit at a steady pace, not rushing, not lingering. Behind me, I heard her calling after me, her words blurring into the general courthouse noise, and I kept going anyway. On the way out, I passed a row of bulletin boards filled with notices about hearings, deadlines, and procedural rules, and the absurdity hit me. This building was full of people trying to control outcomes with paper, and Evelyn was still trying to control outcomes with emotion. We were speaking different languages now, and mine had stamps. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner than the courthouse air, and I stood on the steps for a moment, letting my chest loosen. I checked my phone without reading her newest messages, and I made sure the photo of the stamped page was saved and backed up, because if she could find me at the courthouse, then she could find other ways to push. I needed every action to leave a footprint that was mine, not hers. I walked to my car and sat inside without starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel as if it could offer moral advice. The truth was simple and ugly. She didn't just want me to accept her ex as a friend. She wanted me to accept that my boundaries were negotiable and that her desires were definitions of reality. The courthouse encounter had proven something else, too. When she felt the record forming, she panicked. Panic makes liars sloppy, and sloppy creates openings. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't her. It was an email notification from the building's HOA account, a bland subject line about an agenda update, and I felt that familiar cold clarity return. Grant Vale was moving pieces. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife or orbiting her like a parasite. He was trying to shape the environment I lived and worked in, the social and procedural air I breathed every day. When I got back to the building later that afternoon, I saw him for the first time in person since I left. Not in a dramatic confrontation, not in a shouting match, but in the quiet cruelty of proximity. He stood near the lobby desk talking with someone as if he belonged there, posture relaxed, smile practiced, eyes scanning like he was taking inventory. It was the kind of body language that says, I am protected by the room. When he saw me, he didn't look away. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused, like a man who believes rules exist to be used. I did not stop. I did not greet him. I walked past with the same calm I had used at the courthouse window, because calm is how you tell predators you are not prey. I felt his gaze follow me, and I felt something else too, something that made my jaw tighten without my permission. The certainty that he had been in this building more than he should have been, and that he had been doing it openly because he assumed no one would challenge him. I went upstairs, closed my office door, and opened my evidence ledger. I added one new line, clean and factual. Courthouse filing received and photographed. Wife attempted public confrontation at courthouse. Ex present in building lobby on return. Then I underlined the last part once because it wasn't just personal anymore. It was structural. And as I stared at that underline, I realized the next phase was already starting. Because Grant Vale didn't just want my wife, he wanted the narrative of my collapse. And he was going to try to write it in committee language and posted notices until everyone believed it. The problem for him was simple. I had stamps, dates, and a ledger, and I had stopped caring how charming the lie looked. I started treating my life like a building inspection, because if you want to know where the rot is, you stop listening to excuses and you start looking for patterns. The courthouse stamp sat inside my folder like a small, boring weapon, and I kept it boring on purpose, because boring is what makes a liar nervous, since a liar can fight emotion but cannot argue with a clean timeline that refuses to raise its voice. After I saw Grant in the lobby with that relaxed posture he wore like immunity, I went upstairs to my office and closed the door. Then I stared at the notes I had already written until I realized the next move was not to confront him, or her, or anyone, but to confirm something simple, whether the building itself had been watching when she thought only I could see. The camera I needed was not hidden, and it was not clever, because I am not clever in ways that require shame, and I am not interested in games that end with cops or headlines. The doorbell camera faced my own doorway, installed months earlier after a package went missing, and it existed for the most boring reason on earth, which is why it was perfect now. The footage belonged to the system, but the view belonged to me, and the timestamps belonged to reality, which is the only side I had left. I waited until the evening, when the building got quieter and the hallways stopped filling with people who might notice me looking too focused. Then I sat in the hotel room with my laptop on the bed and logged into the account that still carried our shared life like a scar. I told myself I was only checking for a simple question, the kind you ask when you want to keep your dignity intact. And that question was whether she had brought him to my door during the days she was flooding my phone with devotion and accusation. I didn't expect the truth to show up like a fist, because truth usually shows up like a receipt. And receipts are the least romantic things in the world. The app loaded slowly, offering thumbnails of deliveries, neighbors walking dogs, people carrying groceries, and my own face sometimes, crossing the frame with a toolbox like a man who had no idea what his marriage was becoming behind his back. I scrolled by date, not hunting for drama, just aligning the days that mattered with the transactions and metadata I had already collected, because the ledger was starting to feel like a second heartbeat in my chest. The first thing I noticed was how easy it is to lie when you assume the world is not recording you, because she moved with that assumption, casual and confident, like someone who believed the only witness that counted was her own story. On one clip, she appeared in the frame late in the evening, coat on, hair done, standing too close to someone whose face was turned away from the camera. And even though the camera didn't give me a clean portrait, it gave me something better. A silhouette, a posture, the size and shape of a man who didn't belong there, and the timestamp sitting calmly in the corner like a judge that never blinks. She leaned in slightly, then stepped inside, and the door closed behind them with the same clean click I had heard when I left, which was almost funny, because the sound of finality doesn't care who makes it. I rewound the clip and watched it again, slower this time, paying attention to the details people miss when they watch with feelings instead of eyes. The man's coat had a distinctive collar, the kind that sits stiff and sharp, and his shoes flashed briefly under the hallway light with a polished shine that didn't match the building's casual traffic, because most residents don't dress like they're going to a meeting when they're standing outside someone else's door at night. He carried himself like he was entitled to the space. And entitlement has a body language you can recognize even in low-resolution footage because it takes up air without permission. I didn't need his face to know who he was, because Grant had been showing up everywhere lately like a bad smell that thinks it's cologne. I felt my jaw tighten, but I did not let it turn into anger that needed to move, because I had learned in the past 2 weeks that movement can become evidence for the wrong side if you move in the wrong way. Instead, I did what a calm man does when he finally gets a piece of truth big enough to anchor the rest. I captured it cleanly, labeled it, and stored it like something that might be shown to someone who doesn't care how heartbroken I am. I took a still frame of the clip, ensuring the timestamp and date were visible, and I saved it in the same folder as the merchant alerts and the cloud album metadata, because at this point my life had become a museum of small betrayals, each one framed and hung in chronological order. Then, because I wasn't satisfied with one clip, I kept scrolling, and the pattern got louder. Another night, another timestamp, another silhouette, the same kind of closeness that doesn't belong to friendship, because real friends don't hover like that outside your marital doorway unless they are trying to become something else. In one clip, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, looking down the corridor in a quick checking motion, like she was making sure no one else was watching, which was the kind of move that tells you everything about the honesty of the situation. She wasn't worried about my jealousy. She was worried about being seen, and that means she knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway. By the time I had collected 3 still frames with clear timestamps across different days, I stopped scrolling and sat back, letting my eyes rest on the screen as if staring hard enough would turn it into mercy. It didn't, of course. The footage didn't make me feel better, but it did make me feel solid, because now I had proof that lived outside of me, proof that didn't rely on my memory or my tone or my ability to argue with someone who had already chosen their lie. She could call it friendship all day long, but timestamps don't do friendships. They do movements, and movements tell the truth people deny with their mouths. The next morning, the building felt different, not because anything had changed in the concrete, but because I had changed in it. When you carry the truth in your pocket, you walk heavier, not from sadness, but from certainty. And certainty makes you quiet in a way that other people misread as arrogance. I went through my tasks like normal, but I noticed the new details that had been invisible before, like the way the front desk staff avoided eye contact, or the way certain residents paused in conversation when I walked past, or the way the lobby notice board had gained another fresh HOA posting with Grant's name on the bottom, printed in the same neutral font that tried to disguise personal hostility as civic duty. The notice was about hallway conduct and visitor compliance, written in broad language that could target anyone, but it felt aimed because Grant liked to throw nets and pretend he wasn't fishing. I stood in front of it long enough to read every line, not because I was intimidated, but because I was learning his tactics. He wanted to create an environment where he looked like a guardian of order while quietly breaking the most basic order of all, which is respecting a marriage he didn't belong in. It was almost artful, in a twisted way, like watching someone clean their hands in public after using them for something dirty in private. I took a photo of the notice and walked away, because I was done treating his paper as power. Paper only matters when it becomes record, and record only matters when it is typed, dated, and witnessed. He could post as many notices as he wanted, but I was building something stronger than postings. I was building a packet. Later that afternoon, I ran into Lena Ward near the mailroom, and it was the kind of encounter that looks casual to everyone else, but feels like a hinge to the person living it. Lena was one of those neighbors who never seemed to be rushing, the kind who knows every sound in a building and never admits it out loud, and she greeted me with the smallest nod, not overly friendly, not cold, just acknowledging that I existed without demanding a performance. We had exchanged polite words over the years, mostly about packages and maintenance issues, and I knew enough about her to understand she didn't like drama, which is exactly why I trusted that she would not exaggerate. She didn't ask me what happened with my wife, and that restraint was rare enough to feel like respect. Instead, she made a small comment about how busy the hallway had been lately, how many late visitors the building seemed to have, and she said it in a way that sounded like a complaint about noise but carried an undercurrent of observation. People like Lena don't accuse, they note. I kept my voice calm and asked carefully if she had noticed anyone specific near my unit during the past week, and I made sure my question sounded like a security concern, not a jealous husband's trap. Because I wasn't trying to recruit her into my feelings, I was trying to confirm a timeline. Lena paused, not for long, but long enough to show she was deciding whether telling the truth would cost her peace. Then she said she had noticed a man in a sharp coat near my door late at night on more than one occasion, and she mentioned a specific time window. Not a story, not a guess, just a time, because time is what careful people offer when they want to stay out of mess. She added that the man's car had idled near the entrance once, and she remembered it because the headlights had flashed into her living room like a silent intrusion, and she didn't like being intruded on. I didn't ask for more, and I didn't push her to name him, because naming invites emotion, and I didn't want her emotional, I wanted her precise. I thanked her, then I excused myself, because the moment you linger is the moment a neutral witness becomes part of a rumor machine, and I wasn't going to do that to her. Back in my office, I opened my notebook and wrote down her name and her time window in one sentence, keeping it as clean as everything else. Then I signed the line beneath it, because I was building a ledger that could survive scrutiny. That evening, alone in the hotel, I laid out the evidence like a man preparing for a storm, not because I enjoyed it, but because storms don't care about your comfort. I printed one of the doorbell still frames, because digital proof is good, but printed proof has a weight that changes how people behave when you place it on a table. I slid it into a clear sleeve and labeled it with the date and time. Then I placed the merchant alert screenshot printout behind it, then the cloud album metadata capture, then the courthouse received page, creating a stack that looked boring and official, which is the opposite of how betrayal feels. And that contrast made me almost smile. Her messages continued, of course, because she didn't know any other way to exist in conflict. They shifted from pleading to anger, from anger to threats, from threats to nostalgia, and back again, and each shift made her look less like a partner and more like someone trying to keep a door from closing by jamming her foot into the frame. I did not respond. I only added one new line to my ledger when she slipped and contradicted herself in a way she didn't notice, referencing a night she claimed she had been home early, while my doorbell timestamp showed her arriving late with someone beside her. It wasn't a confession, but it was a crack, and cracks are where the collapse starts. I stared at my phone screen for a long minute, not reading everything, just recognizing the woman behind the words, and the question I had texted her earlier came back with new weight because now it wasn't rhetorical. Who are you? Who becomes this person and still expects to be loved for it? Who demands trust while treating truth like an enemy? When I finally turned the lamp off, the room went dark and quiet, but my mind stayed bright with dates and times because once you see the structure of a lie, you can't unsee it. And as I lay there listening to the hotel heater rattle, I realized the next pressure point wasn't going to be the building or the HOA, because Grant had already started tightening those screws. The next pressure point was going to be family, because family loves to fix things with feelings, and I was about to walk into that with documents instead of tears, which meant someone was going to accuse me of being cruel. And if Evelyn thought she could survive this by switching masks, she was about to learn that masks don't work when the room has timestamps. By the time the family dinner invite came, it was not an invitation in the warm sense of the word. It was a summons disguised as concern. I could tell from the timing alone. Evelyn had been texting me nonstop, cycling through fury, pleading, and moral lectures like she was flipping cards, until she found a face that moved me. And when none of it worked, she did what people like her always do when they lose control of one target. She widened the audience. She needed witnesses. She needed a room full of people who remembered the version of her that smiled at holidays, the version of me that kept the peace, the version of our marriage that looked stable enough for everyone to borrow comfort from it. If she could get them to pressure me, she could claim she wasn't manipulating, she was being supported. My father, Owen, had that old-school belief that a family should solve things around a table because tables make people behave, and because he grew up in a world where problems were handled privately, even when they started in public. In another life, that belief might have helped. In this one, it was just another arena, another place where Evelyn could hold up her emotions like proof and hope nobody asked for dates. I did not want to go. I also knew I had to. Refusing the dinner would let her paint me as cowardly and cruel, and I was not going to give her that paint. My method was simple now, even if the situation was anything but. I would move through each pressure point calmly, I would document what mattered, and I would never let her force me into a scene that made me look unstable. She could call me cold, she could call me arrogant, she could call me heartless, but she would not be able to call me reckless, not if I stayed disciplined. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because being early is how you control a space without demanding it. My father's house smelled like roasted meat and onions, the kind of smell that usually makes a person feel safe, and I hated that it didn't work on me anymore. The porch light cast a pale circle over the steps, and I stood under it for a moment, letting my shoulders settle before I knocked, because I knew what waited inside wasn't dinner, it was a tribunal pretending to be love. My father opened the door with the same look he wore when he was trying to hide worry behind authority. He had always been a man who believed strength meant keeping your voice steady and your back straight, and I could see in his eyes that he was already judging how I held myself. I stepped inside, greeted him, and let him see that I was calm, that I was not stumbling, not raging, not falling apart. That mattered to him more than anything I could say. Evelyn was already there. Of course she was. She sat at the table like she belonged to the narrative, posture perfect, hair done, face composed into a sadness that looked rehearsed but still managed to pull at the instincts of anyone who preferred emotions to facts. She looked up when I entered, and her expression flickered with relief, like she had won something just by getting me into the room. Then it tightened into offense, because she could sense I wasn't there to surrender. There were other faces too, family friends and a cousin, people who didn't know the details but knew enough to smell drama and pretend they didn't. They greeted me politely, the way people greet someone they feel compelled to judge but don't want to admit it. I returned the politeness, because politeness is a weapon when used correctly, and it was one of the few weapons I could use without giving anyone grounds to accuse me of cruelty. We sat, plates were placed, glasses filled, forks clinked. For the first 10 minutes, my father tried to keep it normal. He talked about weather, about a neighbor's roof repair, about a new store opening down the road, and everyone nodded and played along because pretending is easier than admitting the room is poisoned. Evelyn played her part too, offering small smiles, small comments, little touches of domestic normal that made it look like we were still a couple who had merely had a disagreement. It was almost impressive, watching her perform stability while my phone back at the hotel held a wall of frantic messages that proved she couldn't tolerate a single day without control. Then the tension did what tension always does. It rose like steam until someone couldn't pretend they weren't sweating. My father turned the conversation toward us in the careful way older men do when they believe the right tone can force truth to appear. He said he didn't want drama. He wanted resolution. He said he didn't want sides. He wanted clarity. He said he wanted to understand what happened because people were talking, and he hated that more than he hated conflict. He looked at me with that firm softness that used to make me feel like a boy who needed correction, and he asked, in a way that sounded reasonable, why I left so suddenly. Evelyn's eyes stayed on me, bright and expectant, like she was waiting for me to say something messy, something emotional, something that would let her claim I was unstable. I could almost hear Grant's voice behind her expressions, not literally, but as a strategy, because people like Grant teach people like Evelyn how to win rooms without having to win truth. They teach them how to frame. They teach them how to bait. I let my fork rest. I swallowed slowly. I breathed through my nose the way I do when someone complains about a building problem they caused and expects me to apologize for it. Then I answered my father plainly, without heat, without pleading, without the kind of detail that could turn into debate. I told him she gave me a direct ultimatum, and I chose to take it seriously. I told him I left by morning because I would not negotiate dignity. I did not mention screenshots. I did not mention timestamps. I did not mention the doorbell still frames sitting neatly in sleeves like small, silent witnesses. I wasn't there to dump evidence on a dinner plate. I was there to let her try to lie in a room where the lie would have to hold its shape. Evelyn reacted instantly, as if she had been waiting for the trigger word ultimatum. She leaned forward slightly, voice sharpening, trying to reframe what she had said as a boundary and what I had done as abandonment. She described it as me being controlling, me being jealous, me refusing to accept her friendships. She painted herself as a woman trapped between a husband's insecurity and her own need for independence. It was a beautiful story, if you liked fiction more than math. My father frowned, because the idea of a man leaving overnight offended his sense of order. I could see him wanting to tell me to be patient, to be a husband, to be the bigger person. He was a good man, but good men sometimes mistake endurance for virtue. He looked like he was about to lecture me, and I let him, because sometimes the best way to win a room is to let the room show its bias first. When he finished, I nodded as if I respected his perspective. Because I did. Then I asked Evelyn one question, carefully chosen, because one question can be a trap if it is small enough to seem harmless. I asked her to tell the room, clearly, where she was on one specific evening, the one she had referenced earlier when she claimed she was just running errands and felt too tired to talk. She blinked, then smiled faintly, as if amused by my attempt at precision. She answered quickly, too quickly, the way people answer when they are stepping over something broken and hoping nobody notices the crack. She named a place, she named a reason, she named a time window. It sounded plausible. It also sounded like a story, and stories always reveal themselves when you ask them to repeat their details. I let her finish, then I asked her to repeat it, slowly, because my father hadn't heard the exact times, and I wanted the room to be sure. She repeated it, but the second time the time window shifted slightly, not enough to register as a lie to someone who only listens with sympathy, but enough to matter if you have a ledger in your head. She changed the start time by half an hour, then changed it back, then added a detail about stopping somewhere else. The room nodded along, because most people don't want truth, they want comfort, and comfort is the enemy of precision. I nodded too. Then I pulled a small notepad from my jacket pocket and placed it beside my plate, slowly, where everyone could see it without it looking like a weapon. I picked up my pen and wrote down her cover story exactly as she said it, not with commentary, not with sarcasm, just the words, the place, the time, the reason. I wrote it like a clerk, because clerks don't argue, they record. The act itself shifted the room. It made people sit back slightly because written words feel more serious than spoken ones. Spoken words evaporate. Written words stay. Evelyn watched my pen with a tightness around her mouth that she couldn't hide, and I could tell she didn't like being recorded. Liars love conversations because conversations blur. They hate notes because notes harden. My father noticed too, and his brow tightened because he suddenly sensed this wasn't a typical marriage argument where both sides were emotional and the truth lived somewhere in the middle. He sensed, maybe for the first time, that I wasn't interested in a middle. I was interested in accurate. Evelyn tried to laugh it off, calling it unnecessary, calling it dramatic, calling it cold. She implied I was turning dinner into an interrogation. That word, interrogation, was meant to make me look cruel. It didn't land the way she wanted. It made the room quieter, because no one likes being reminded that they might be witnessing something real. I kept my voice steady and said I wasn't interrogating, I was documenting, because I wanted to stop living in arguments that changed shape every time someone got emotional. I said I wanted clarity, and clarity requires specifics. Then I asked her one more question. Still small, still clean, still impossible to answer without risk. I asked her whether her ex had been in our building that same night. That did it. Her expression flashed with something raw, a brief panic that betrayed the performance, and she covered it quickly with outrage. She denied it instantly, loudly, as if volume could erase the possibility. She insisted I was obsessed. She insisted I was inventing enemies. She insisted her ex was a friend, and a friend doesn't need permission. She said that last part like it was wisdom. My father's face tightened again, because the word ex changes the temperature of a room. People think they are modern until you say ex, then their instincts wake up. He glanced between us, then asked Evelyn, more gently than I would have, why she needed that friendship badly enough to risk her marriage. It was a fair question. She answered it with something that sounded like empowerment, but smelled like contempt. She said a spouse shouldn't dictate friendships. She said trust should be automatic. She said if I couldn't handle it, that was my weakness. I watched her say it in front of my father, in front of people who had known us for years, and the strangest part was that it didn't hurt the way it would have months ago. It confirmed, it clarified, it showed me that her ultimatum wasn't a moment of anger, it was a philosophy. She genuinely believed my comfort was less important than her freedom to blur boundaries, and she believed that if I objected, the objection itself was evidence of my flaw. My cousin shifted uncomfortably because even two people who hate conflict, the tension was starting to look less like a disagreement and more like a character reveal. A family friend tried to soften it by suggesting counseling, suggesting compromise, suggesting time apart, as if time apart was a new idea and not the reality I was already living. Evelyn latched onto that suggestion immediately, because counseling sounds responsible, and responsible sounds innocent. She said she wanted to fix things. She said she was willing. She said she missed me. Her eyes watered at the perfect moment. I didn't react to the tears. Tears are real sometimes. Tears are also useful. Evelyn knew how to use them, and I wasn't going to pretend I didn't know that anymore. Instead, I did something that made the room go still. I slid the notepad slightly toward my father, not aggressively, just enough for him to see what I had written. One sentence, one cover story, one time window. I told him calmly that this was what she said happened, and that I had written it down because I was tired of shifting explanations and gaslight fog. I told him I wasn't asking him to pick a side, I was asking him to remember the details when the details changed later. My father stared at the page longer than he needed to. He wasn't reading for content, he was reading for implication. He understood the point. He also understood, perhaps with an uncomfortable jolt, that I had become the kind of man who no longer trusted emotional persuasion, even from family. That realization made him sad, and I saw it in the way his shoulders dipped slightly. Evelyn's voice sharpened again because she could feel control slipping. She accused me of humiliating her. She accused me of weaponizing my father. She accused me of trying to turn everyone against her. She was careful not to mention Grant by name, because saying his name too much in front of family would raise questions she couldn't manage. I kept my tone even and said I wasn't humiliating her. She was humiliating herself by demanding trust while refusing accountability. I didn't say it to sting her. I said it because it was true, and truth without heat is the most insulting thing you can offer a person who thrives on drama. My father finally spoke again, and his voice had changed. It wasn't angry, it was wary. He told Evelyn to stop calling me weak for having boundaries. He told her that if she wanted the marriage, she needed to act like she respected it. He didn't accuse her of cheating. He didn't need to. He simply refused to validate her framing, and that refusal hit her harder than any shouted accusation would have. Dinner after that felt like eating in a room where someone had broken glass under the table. People chewed carefully. People avoided eye contact. Evelyn kept trying to reset the mood, but the reset wouldn't take. Because once a room senses something is off, it becomes harder to lie without someone noticing the strain. When the plates were cleared, I stood and thanked my father for the meal, and I said I would not stay late. Evelyn tried to follow me to the door, her expression swinging back toward pleading, back toward softness, as if softness could erase the last hour. I didn't let her corner me in the hallway. I kept distance, I kept my hands visible, I left clean. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap that felt deserved, and I walked to my car with my shoulders squared, not because I felt strong, but because I felt settled. I had come to the dinner expecting pressure. I had gotten it. I had also gotten something else, something I needed more than sympathy. I had placed her cover story into written form in front of witnesses, and once a lie is written down, it becomes harder to reshape without leaving fingerprints. On the drive back to the hotel, my phone buzzed again, and I didn't look. I didn't need to. I already knew what would come next. Evelyn would rewrite what happened at that table. She would claim I attacked her. She would claim I manipulated my father. She would claim I was cold and unfair. She would try to turn my calm into cruelty. The difference now was simple. My father had seen the moment her mask slipped, and I had her own cover story in ink, dated, signed, and ready to be compared against whatever version she tried to sell tomorrow. The morning after the dinner, I woke up with that strange calm you only get when you stop hoping for the best. Hope makes people soft, and softness is exactly what Evelyn and Grant had been counting on, the kind of softness that convinces a man to return home just to prove he is not the villain. I stayed at the hotel again because I could already sense the direction she was taking the story, and I wasn't going to walk back into a room where I would be forced to defend myself against accusations built from her feelings instead of her facts. When I turned my phone on, the screen filled instantly, like the device had been holding its breath all night. There were more messages than I wanted to count. Some from her, some from people who had never texted me about my marriage before. And I knew without reading much that Evelyn had already started the campaign. She always worked faster when she felt her control slipping, like panic turned into productivity. The first message I actually opened was from my cousin, a short line asking if I was okay and suggesting I talk to Evelyn privately because she seemed really hurt. Hurt was the word people use when they don't want to say suspicious, because suspicious would force them to choose what they believe. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My strategy was not to win hearts. It was to build a record that survived hearts changing their minds. Instead of engaging in group emotion, I did what I had been doing every day since I left. I opened the ledger. I looked at the list of proofs I already had. Merchant alert screenshots, bank printout, shared cloud album metadata, doorbell still frames with clear timestamps, my father's witnessed cover story written in ink, and the courthouse stamped receipt protected in a sleeve. It was a clean chain, but I needed something that connected her spoken explanations to a documented schedule contradiction, because schedules are the backbone of lies. People can deny feelings, but they can't deny being in two places at once. The tool for that wasn't a spy gadget. It wasn't hacking. It wasn't anything glamorous. It was our shared calendar, the same domestic grid we used for dentist appointments, family birthdays, and reminders to pay the utility bill. Evelyn had kept it because it made her look responsible. Grant probably didn't realize how often the most boring tools become the sharpest knives. I logged into the calendar account from my laptop, and I pulled up the week view, then the month view. Then I narrowed it down to the days that matched the merchant alerts and the doorbell timestamps. I didn't scroll like a jealous husband trying to catch a secret message. I scrolled like a man comparing invoices. I was looking for overlaps, for events she claimed were real that suddenly looked empty, for volunteer meetings that were scheduled then quietly erased, for work calls that never had a location, for any pattern that made her cover stories look less like life and more like a manufactured alibi. The pattern didn't take long to show itself. On the days she had claimed she was stuck late at work, the calendar had no work meeting entries, no appointment blocks, nothing that justified a late-night absence. On the days she had claimed she had a volunteer committee meeting, there was an entry, yes, but it was the kind of entry people make when they want to show effort without leaving details. A vague title with no address, no invitees, no notes. On one of those days, the entry disappeared between views, as if she had cleaned it up after the fact, forgetting that shared calendars keep histories in the small ways, in the way event remnants still appear in notifications, in the way recurring patterns still leave shadows. I stared at the week view until my eyes stopped searching for emotional meaning and started seeing structure. Evelyn had been using the calendar as a prop. A calendar is supposed to reflect a life. Her calendar was starting to reflect a defense. I exported the week view as a PDF, choosing the cleanest display that showed the dates, the event titles, and the time blocks. I didn't add commentary because commentary makes it personal, and personal makes it easier to dismiss. I wanted the calendar to speak in its own dull, damning language. Once the PDF was saved, I opened it, confirmed the details were legible, and then I took a screenshot of the header that showed the week range. Because dates matter, and people will argue about anything that isn't nailed down. As I worked, my phone buzzed with a new notification. Not from Evelyn, but from the building's HOA email chain. A meeting invite subject line appeared. Compliance review meeting. Attendance required. That phrase, attendance required, was Grant's favorite kind of intimidation, because it sounded official while remaining vague. It was pressure disguised as procedure. I didn't accept the invite immediately. I didn't decline it either. I saved a screenshot of the email subject line first, because the simplest proof is often the first one people forget to collect. Then I forwarded it to an email folder I had created for myself, because I wasn't just dealing with a marriage collapse. I was dealing with a coordinated narrative move inside the building where I worked, and that meant I needed to treat every communication like it might later be compared against claims of overreaction and misunderstanding. When I arrived at the building later that day, the lobby felt like it had been painted with new opinions. People didn't openly stare, but they didn't need to. The silence was enough. Even the doorman-like security staff, who usually greeted me with a nod, gave me a look that lingered half a second longer than normal, the look of someone who had heard a story and wasn't sure if it was safe to ask questions. I walked past them and went to my office because I wasn't going to perform reassurance for an audience of neighbors. My job wasn't to soothe their curiosity. My job was to handle the building's problems, and right now the building's biggest problem was that its HOA president was using policy as a weapon while pretending it was for community safety. Mid-afternoon, I received a second HOA message, this time from Grant himself, written in that polished, measured tone men like him use when they want to provoke you without sounding provocative. He referenced recent disturbances, community concerns, and professional standards, and he suggested that my personal situation might be impacting my role. It was clever because it didn't accuse me of anything specific, which meant it couldn't be disproven, and it implied everything, which meant it could stain me without evidence. I stared at the message for a long minute, and I felt the old instinct rise, the one that wants to march down to the lobby and confront him in front of whoever would watch. That instinct is a trap. It turns your justified anger into their proof of your instability. Grant wanted me to react like a man out of control because then he could claim his policies were necessary. He wanted me to become his reason, so I did the opposite. I replied with a single calm sentence acknowledging receipt and requesting that all concerns be stated in specific terms, in writing, with dates, times, and cited policy lines. I added that I would attend any scheduled meeting and comply with standard procedure. Then I stopped. No threats, no accusations, no mention of Evelyn, no mention of doorbell footage or bank alerts. I gave him a bureaucratic wall because bureaucratic walls can't be shamed into collapsing. That evening, I sat in my office after most residents were home, and I printed the calendar PDF. I placed it on my desk beside the notes from the dinner, the merchant printout, and the doorbell still frame sleeves. I didn't spread them out like a conspiracy board. I kept them stacked, labeled, and boring, because boring means credible. Then I used a marker to highlight the empty time blocks on the calendar that corresponded with the nights she claimed she was busy with work or volunteer duties. I highlighted only one line per proof because over-highlighting looks hysterical, and I wasn't going to look hysterical. I thought about Evelyn's likely next move, because she had patterns too. Once she realized I wasn't coming home to argue, she would escalate socially. She would push friends to message me, she would push family to pressure me, she might even show up at the building again to create a scene where I looked cruel for refusing to engage. She would probably frame my calm as punishment and my boundaries as manipulation, because those labels let her avoid the real issue, her choices. Grant's next move was already in motion. The meeting invite wasn't just about compliance, it was about stage setting. He wanted a room with witnesses where he could imply I was unstable, where he could posture as a civic leader protecting the community, and where Evelyn could play the wounded wife if she decided to attend. He wanted to blend personal scandal into professional consequence because that is how men like him win. They don't win by truth. They win by controlling where truth is allowed to speak. I wasn't going to give him that control. Instead, I planned to walk into his meeting with only what I needed: the calendar export, the HOA notices, and the simplest possible timeline connecting his sudden policy concerns to my marital boundary. I wasn't going to accuse him of sleeping with my wife in a compliance meeting because that would be emotional, and emotions are what he feeds on. I would simply show that the supposed disturbances began when I refused to accept his presence, and that every complaint he filed against me lacked specificity. I would force him to either name his claims or admit he had none. On the drive back to the hotel, my phone buzzed again, and this time I saw a new text from Evelyn flash across the lock screen. It wasn't pleading, it wasn't angry, it was something worse. A controlled moral statement designed to be forwarded. She wrote about how I was punishing her, how I was stonewalling, how I was emotionally abusive, and she added that she had screenshots of my coldness, because she couldn't understand that silence isn't abuse, it is refusal. That was when I realized the mid-story shift was arriving, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a quiet weapon. She was preparing a narrative where I was dangerous. That was not just marital conflict anymore. That was reputational sabotage. I went into the hotel room and sat on the bed, holding my phone like it might bite. Then I opened the shared storage where we kept random household files, the kind of place people forget exists because it is too boring to be interesting. I searched for recent documents, not because I wanted to invade her privacy, but because it was still our shared household storage, and the accusation she was hinting at could destroy me if it gained traction. If she was building a story about abuse, it wouldn't start in court. It would start in drafts. It didn't take long to find it. A document file with a neutral name, something like notes or personal, created weeks ago, long before she screamed her ultimatum. I opened it, and my chest tightened, not from shock, but from disgust. It was a drafted narrative, not a diary entry, not therapy notes. A structured story about how I had been controlling, isolating, emotionally unsafe, how I had reacted to her friendships, how she feared my temper, how she had to walk on eggshells. It read like a template, like a set of phrases she could paste into texts to friends, or into a complaint, or into a conversation with an HOA board that was already itching for scandal. My hand stayed steady as I took a screenshot of the file list with the creation date visible, then a screenshot of the document header that showed the timestamp. I didn't scroll through the whole thing. I didn't need to. The existence of the draft and the date it was created told me everything. She wasn't reacting to my leaving by inventing this story. She had been preparing this story in advance, like a parachute she planned to pull if her choices ever faced consequences. I saved the screenshots, labeled them, and added one new line to my ledger. Pre-written narrative exists, dated before separation, implying reputational framing. My stomach felt hollow, but my mind felt sharper because now I understood the real game. The affair wasn't just betrayal, it was leverage. It was a way to push me into reacting so that her drafted story could become truth in the mouths of people who would rather believe a crying woman than a quiet man. I turned off the phone, leaned back, and let the silence settle around me like a coat I had chosen. I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder and more useful. Strategy. If Evelyn wanted to turn me into a villain on paper, then my response would be paper too, but cleaner, more precise, and backed by dates. The HOA meeting was no longer just a nuisance. It was a battlefield where record would meet narrative, and I already knew which one wins when a secretary starts typing live. And as I stared at the calendar PDF on my laptop screen, with its empty blocks and its neat lines, I realized the next proof I needed was not another screenshot, not another still frame, but something that placed Grant and Evelyn inside the same formal space, where their story had to hold up under procedure. Because if they were going to destroy me with a draft, I was going to destroy them with minutes. The first time I read the draft she wrote about me, I felt that familiar impulse to confront her, to demand an explanation that would make the world feel sane again. It lasted about 5 seconds. Then the impulse died the way impulses die when you finally accept what you're dealing with. That document wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of therapy phrasing gone wrong. It was a contingency plan, and contingency plans are built by people who expect consequences and want to dodge them. Evelyn had been building an escape hatch long before she screamed her ultimatum, and now that I had seen it, I understood why she never looked worried when she lied. She thought she had a story ready to bury me if I ever stopped playing my role, so I did not text her about it. I did not call her. I did not threaten. I did not accuse. I did the most insulting thing you can do to someone who relies on emotional pressure. I treated it like an administrative risk that needed mitigation. I created a new section in my evidence folder labeled Narrative Counter because I refused to let her draft be the first written record of my character. If she wanted to play the paper game, she was going to learn that I was better at paperwork than she was at performance. I saved the screenshots of the file list and the document header with the creation dates visible. Then I printed them, because printed pages have a gravity that screenshots on a phone don't, and I slid them into sleeves the same way I had sleeved everything else. Clean, labeled, boring, true. The next day, I kept my face neutral in the building, even though inside I felt like I was walking through a hallway full of invisible accusations. The rumors had changed tone. They weren't just about a couple fighting. They were about me being cold, me being controlling, me being someone who abandoned his wife and refused to speak to her. It was all subtle enough to feel plausible and ugly enough to stick. That was the danger of Evelyn's draft. She didn't need to prove it in court. She needed to seed it socially, where no one asks for proof and everyone thinks their feelings are evidence. By late morning, I got another message from the HOA board email chain confirming the compliance review meeting date and time, with a reminder that attendance was required and a note about community welfare. The phrase community welfare made me almost laugh, because Grant Vale didn't care about welfare. He cared about control, and welfare was simply the outfit control wore to look respectable. I saved the invite subject line again and printed it, because repetition matters when someone later claims they never pressured you. I spent the afternoon preparing exactly what I would bring to that meeting and nothing else. People lose cases and reputations because they bring too much. Too much looks frantic. Too much looks like vengeance. Too much invites arguments about intent. I wasn't going to argue intent. I was going to argue dates. On the table in my hotel room, I laid out 4 items in order. First, the courthouse stamped receipt sleeve, because it established that I had taken a lawful step early and quietly. Second, the calendar week export PDF, because it showed the empty blocks that contradicted her claimed meetings. Third, one doorbell still frame with the timestamp visible, because it showed a late-night visit pattern without needing a face. Fourth, the screenshot of her draft's creation date, because it explained why the rumors were suddenly shifting into character assassination. I didn't plan to show all of it. I planned to show only what I needed, and I planned to keep the rest as a backstop in case anyone tried to twist the narrative in the room. Before I left the hotel for the meeting day, I added one small step to the ledger that felt almost ridiculous but mattered. I wrote a simple timeline line on paper, including the date of her ultimatum, the date I left, the date of the courthouse stamp, and the date the HOA meeting was called. Then I signed it. That one page, with my signature, wasn't proof of her betrayal, but it was proof of my consistency. And consistency is the enemy of smear campaigns. The evening of the meeting, the building's clubhouse looked too cheerful for what it was about to host. The room was arranged with folding chairs in neat rows and a long table at the front, where the board members would sit like judges who pretended they weren't enjoying it. The fluorescent lights made everyone look slightly worse, which was a small mercy because at least nobody could pretend the atmosphere was romantic. Residents filtered in, murmuring softly, checking phones, choosing seats that lined up with their alliances. People love pretending they're neutral, but where they sit always tells the truth. I arrived early, again, because early is control without arrogance. I nodded to the facilitator, Tessa Brigg, a woman who ran meetings like she ran traffic, with rules, patience, and a refusal to be charmed. I respected her. She reminded me of the courthouse clerk, the kind of person who doesn't care who cries, they care what is documented. I took a seat near the aisle, not front row, not back row, because I didn't want to look like I was seeking attention or hiding. I placed my folder on my lap and kept my hands still. Grant arrived 5 minutes later, and the room shifted like someone had changed the oxygen level. He wore a suit that fit well and a smile that fit better. He greeted people with the ease of a man who has never paid for his own consequences. When he saw me, his smile did not change. It simply became more pointed, like a blade polished to look friendly. He sat at the board table and began shuffling papers as if he was already the authority over everyone's comfort. Then Evelyn walked in. She did not come in quietly. She came in with the posture of someone stepping onto a stage, and she wore a look that was designed to evoke sympathy without looking desperate. She scanned the room quickly, found Grant, found me, and chose a seat that placed her close enough to Grant to imply unity, but far enough to claim independence if anyone called it out. That choice alone told me everything. She didn't want privacy, she wanted proximity as a statement. The meeting started with routine items, a dull parade of budget notes and maintenance complaints meant to lull the room into thinking this was ordinary. Grant waited until the room's attention softened, then he introduced the compliance review topic with a measured tone, framing it as a necessity due to recent disturbances. He never said my name at first. He let the room fill in the blank because people are always eager to complete a story they've been fed. Tessa, the facilitator, asked for specifics. That was her gift, specifics. She wasn't interested in adjectives like disturbing. She wanted dates, times, and events. Grant provided vague references to hallway issues, visitor concerns, and resident discomfort, and the vaguer he stayed, the more I could see Tessa's patience thinning. Vogue claims are comfort food for gossip, but they don't survive procedure. When it was time for me to respond, I stood without drama, keeping my shoulders relaxed and my voice level. I did not accuse Grant of anything personal. I did not mention Evelyn's ex by name. I did not mention my marriage. I said I wanted all allegations stated clearly and tied to specific policy lines, because I needed to respond properly. I said I had complied with every posted rule and asked that any complaint about my conduct include a date, time, and witness, the same way a proper complaint always should. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his composure, because I was forcing him to do something he hated, define the lie. A board member tried to soften it by saying the meeting wasn't about accusations, it was about community standards. But Tessa pushed back politely and said that without specifics, the board could not act responsibly. That was the moment I felt the room tilt. People who came in hungry for drama suddenly realized they might have to listen to process instead. Grant then pivoted. He started talking about emotional volatility and public incidents, and he glanced toward Evelyn as if inviting her to confirm the picture. Evelyn spoke up with a trembling voice that sounded practiced, describing how difficult things had been, how she feared escalation, how she wanted peace. She used the same phrases I had seen in her draft, just softened enough to sound spontaneous. It was disgusting and impressive at the same time. She was test-running the narrative in a semi-official room. I didn't react. I didn't deny it emotionally. I didn't say, "How dare you?" Instead, I asked her one question, calmly, in the same tone I used at the family dinner, because one question can expose a script. I asked her to state one specific incident, with a date and time, where I had been volatile in public. Not her feelings, not her fear. An incident. She hesitated. Not long, but long enough. Then she offered an example that was vague, describing me walking away, describing me refusing to talk, describing me abandoning her. She did not describe yelling or threats or violence. She described silence. She described my refusal to perform. And the room, for the first time, looked uncertain, because silence does not match the picture of danger she was trying to paint. Grant tried to tighten the frame by suggesting my silence was provocative, that my refusal to engage created tension, that it was destabilizing. He was trying to criminalize calm. He was trying to make self-control sound like a threat. That was his trick. If you can't prove a man is dangerous, you imply that his restraint is a form of aggression. Tessa didn't like it. I could see it in her face. She asked again, more firmly, for any actionable complaint tied to a policy violation, because that was what the meeting was supposed to address. The room quieted. Someone coughed. Someone shifted in their chair. The drama was turning into paperwork, and that was killing the fun. That was when I used the smallest possible proof, because small proofs are hard to frame as vengeance. I pulled out the calendar week export, held it up briefly, and said that several claims being made about my instability were happening at the same time as a coordinated narrative shift and an HOA pressure campaign. I said I had documented scheduling contradictions related to the larger issue and that I would provide those documents through proper channels if needed. I did not show doorbell frames. I did not show bank alerts. I did not show the draft. I simply introduced the existence of documentation without dumping it, because the threat of a clean record is sometimes more powerful than the record itself. Grant's smile tightened. Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap. They understood what I was signaling. I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to fight. I was here to make sure this room became part of the record, not part of their story. Tessa asked if anyone else had first-hand complaints against me, dated and specific. The room stayed quiet. People looked away. No one wanted to raise their hand and own a lie. No one wanted to be typed into minutes as the person who accused the building superintendent of emotional volatility without evidence. That is what procedure does. It makes cowards cautious. Grant, frustrated, called for a brief recess, trying to regain control. Tessa allowed it, but she reminded the room that the meeting would resume and that any statements made would be summarized in the minutes. That reminder mattered. Minutes were the real battlefield, and she was holding the pen. During the recess, Evelyn approached me, staying just close enough that others could see without hearing. She spoke in a low voice, trying to bait me into a private exchange that she could later summarize however she wanted. I didn't engage. I kept my posture open and my eyes steady, and I told her that any communication needed to be written and documented. She tried to smile, as if amused by my formality, but her eyes looked irritated because I wasn't giving her the raw material she needed. Grant watched from across the room, pretending to chat with a board member, but I could see his attention locked onto me, measuring whether I would slip. That was his real goal. Not compliance, not welfare, a slip. When the meeting resumed, Grant attempted to push a motion for enhanced oversight of my role, couched in vague language about ensuring community comfort. Tessa asked for a reason tied to a documented violation. Grant couldn't provide one. He tried to pivot again, but every pivot made him look more political and less principled. Finally, Tessa said that without specific policy violations, no enforcement action could be recommended, and she instructed the secretary, Mara Sloan, to note that the board requested actionable specifics and none were provided at this time. That line, at this time, sounded harmless, but it was deadly because it planted a seed in the minutes that the accusations were airy and the process demanded substance. I sat back down and kept my hands still, feeling the room's energy change from hungry to uneasy. People did not leave entertained, they left curious. Curiosity is the beginning of collapse for a liar, because curious people start asking questions, and questions are where scripts break. As the meeting ended, Evelyn walked out quickly, phone already in her hand, probably texting someone her version of what happened. Grant lingered, trying to shake hands and restore his image, but I noticed the strain in his jaw, the slight stiffness in his smile. He hadn't expected procedure to resist him. He hadn't expected silence to win a round. I left without looking back, my folder still closed, my posture still calm, because the goal tonight wasn't to destroy them, it was to put them on record in a room where their narrative had to face rules. And now, because Tessa had forced the question of specifics, I knew exactly what the next move would be. Grant would try to control the minutes. The next morning, the building felt quieter, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that happens after a room realizes it almost believed something stupid. People who came to the compliance meeting had expected a show, and instead they got procedure. And procedure has a way of making everyone review their own assumptions in private. I walked through the lobby with my usual pace, nodded to the desk, and went upstairs without offering anyone the comfort of a confession, because I wasn't going to soothe rumors by feeding them. Grant, on the other hand, treated the aftermath like a cleanup operation. By noon, a board-wide email arrived with a draft summary of the meeting, written in smooth language that sounded neutral until you read it twice. The summary didn't outright accuse me, but it leaned on phrases like community concern, heightened emotions, and continued monitoring, the kind of phrasing that plants a stain without naming a source. It was the paper equivalent of a smirk. It also had one small detail that confirmed my suspicion immediately. It referenced mutual agreement on next steps, even though there had been no agreement, just a lack of evidence and a facilitator who refused to reward vague claims. Grant was trying to rewrite the minutes before they became official. He wasn't dumb enough to call it rewriting. He called it clarifying, formatting, streamlining. Men like him always call manipulation housekeeping, because it makes the lie sound like a service. And if he could get that summary circulated first, it would become the version residents remembered, because memory is lazy, and printed language feels authoritative. I didn't respond with anger. I responded with precision. I forwarded the email to my own folder, then I saved a screenshot of the subject line, because subject lines are where intent hides when people later claim confusion. Then I opened my evidence ledger and added one sentence. Board email attempts to frame meeting outcome without specifics, dated and saved. The words looked dry on the page, but my stomach tightened anyway, because this was the part of the story where people lose their footing, not because they did something wrong, but because someone else wrote something wrong about them and everyone nodded along. I didn't plan to let Grant have the first written record of what happened in that room. The problem was that I didn't control the official minutes. The board secretary did. Mara Sloan was the kind of person who made herself forgettable on purpose. She sat at the front table during meetings, typed quietly, never performed authority, never sought attention. Most residents could not describe her face. Grant likely assumed that made her harmless. It didn't. People who don't need attention often have the cleanest power because they don't waste it. I didn't approach her like I was recruiting an ally because that would contaminate her neutrality. I approached her like I was protecting process, which was true. I sent one short email to the board address, copying the facilitator, asking for the official minutes once they were finalized and requesting that any summary distributed match the minutes exactly without interpretive language. I did not mention Grant. I did not mention Evelyn. I framed it as a procedural request for accuracy, because accuracy is hard to argue against without revealing you hate it. Within an hour, I received a reply from Tessa, the facilitator, brief and firm. She said the official minutes would be issued after review and that any interim summary should not be treated as final. She didn't call anyone out, but I could feel the message's target, and I could tell she had also noticed Grant's attempt to pre-frame the outcome. That reply mattered more than any emotional reassurance, because it was written, dated, and tied to her authority in the process. Evelyn texted me again that afternoon, long paragraphs in rapid succession, the tone swinging between injured and righteous. She claimed the meeting had been humiliating for her, that people had looked at her differently, that I had set her up by refusing to talk, that my coldness was a form of punishment. She implied that I was the one creating instability. She never once addressed the actual problem, which was the ultimatum she screamed and the man she insisted I accept. She was still trying to win the story without touching the facts. I didn't answer. I didn't even open most of the messages. I only logged one micro detail that mattered. She referenced the meeting as if the board had agreed to watch me, which meant she had either misunderstood on purpose or been told a story by someone who benefited from her believing it. That was a leak in their coordination, and I wrote it down in my ledger as a note, because coordinated liars always slip when they start relying on each other's versions. The real pressure arrived the next day, and it arrived in the most boring clothing possible. A notice appeared in my mailbox slot, printed on HOA letterhead, stating that due to ongoing concerns, the board was scheduling a follow-up standards review and requesting my presence again, along with a suggestion that I bring any relevant documentation. It sounded like a fair request until you noticed the timing and the way it tried to place me on the defensive, as if I was the one who needed to justify my existence. Grant was pushing for a second meeting because the first meeting hadn't given him what he wanted, and a man like Grant always believes the solution to a failed manipulation is to repeat it with a different angle. I photographed the notice beside the day's date on my phone, then I slid it into a clear sleeve. I didn't do it because I expected a courtroom. I did it because I expected a liar to claim later that the pressure didn't happen, or that it happened for noble reasons, and I wasn't going to let noble reasons be invented after the fact. That evening, I sat in my hotel room and stared at the 4 core proofs again. But this time, I didn't feel anxiety. I felt timing. Grant was pushing for another procedural arena. Evelyn was pushing for another emotional arena. They were trying to force me to choose between looking cruel and looking unstable. I wasn't going to choose either. I was going to choose record. I also knew something else now, something colder and more important. If Grant was willing to tamper with meeting narratives, then he had probably already been tampering with other records in the building, in small ways, through soft pressure and friendly conversations, through the kind of helpful edits that never look like edits until someone compares versions. So I made a decision that felt petty, but was actually survival. I stopped relying on the board's distribution list and started relying on public access. The HOA had a resident portal where agendas and minutes were posted for everyone to see. It wasn't a private database. It wasn't a hack. It was a basic community webpage, the kind of thing people ignore until it becomes convenient for gossip. If the minutes were posted there, then any discrepancy between the official record and Grant's summary could be proven without anyone needing to trust my tone. The next morning, I checked the portal, and I saw the minutes had been uploaded. I didn't read them like a man hungry for vindication. I read them like a man checking for a crack in a foundation. The minutes were clean, dated, and detailed. They included Tessa's repeated request for actionable specifics, the board's inability to cite policy violations, and the note that no enforcement action was recommended due to lack of documented grounds. It was exactly what I remembered, written in the dry language that kills rumors because it leaves no room for imagination. Then I noticed the line that made my chest tighten, not from fear, but from opportunity. The minutes included a brief note about an attempted motion for enhanced oversight being tabled, and it listed who proposed it: Grant Vale. It also noted that the motion lacked stated grounds at this time. That phrase, "at this time," wasn't just a polite hedge. It was a record that the chair had attempted to escalate without evidence and the facilitator had refused. It was a small, typed bruise on his authority. I saved a screenshot of that line immediately, ensuring the page header, date, and portal context were visible. Then I saved a second screenshot that showed the upload timestamp, because later, if someone tried to replace the file, I wanted proof of what existed on which day. I printed the screenshots and slid them into sleeves. My evidence packet was starting to look like something you could hand to a neutral person and watch their face change without you saying a word. Grant's summary email now had a problem. His mutual agreement phrasing didn't match the posted minutes. If he kept pushing, he would eventually be forced to explain why he was shaping language. And if he tried to edit the minutes later, he would have to explain the change in the portal record, which meant he would have to make the portal itself part of his lie, which is harder than lying to a room. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I simply noted it and waited. Because people like Grant do not retreat quietly. They escalate, and escalation creates mistakes. The mistake arrived faster than I expected. That afternoon, a resident I barely knew stopped me near the mailroom and said they had received an updated clarification from the board, and they were confused because it sounded different from what they remembered hearing at the meeting. They weren't accusing me, they weren't defending me, they were simply uncertain, and uncertainty is where truth enters if you handle it correctly. I told them calmly that the official minutes were posted on the portal and that they could read the record directly. I did not interpret, I did not argue, I did not ask them what they thought, I gave them a path to a document. Then I walked away, because the moment you try to persuade, you become part of the drama. The document should do the persuading, not my mouth. Later, I received an email from Grant, and I didn't need to open it to feel the intention behind it. The subject line said something like meeting documentation concern, and the tone, even in the preview, sounded like a man trying to maintain dominance while pretending he wasn't rattled. I opened it anyway, slowly, because by now I preferred to know exactly what angle he was using. He wrote that certain sensitive personal matters should not be overemphasized in community records and that he wanted to ensure privacy for all involved. That word privacy made me almost laugh, because the same man had been orbiting my front door at night, and the same woman who demanded I accept her ex was now suddenly worried about discretion. He wasn't worried about privacy. He was worried about the minutes becoming a weapon against him, because the minutes weren't emotional, and emotional is where he could always win. I replied once, again, with a single procedural sentence. I wrote that the posted minutes reflected the meeting proceedings and that any proposed edits should be submitted through the facilitator in writing, with specific references to inaccurate statements. I added that I supported accurate records and opposed interpretive framing. Then I stopped. I gave him no personal hook. I gave him only process. That was when the late twist started to show itself, not as a dramatic secret, but as a structural truth. Grant didn't control the story the way he thought he did, because the story had already become a record in a place he couldn't easily manipulate without leaving fingerprints. He had been relying on charm, on intimidation, on paper summaries sent first, but now he was facing a typed record that didn't care who he was, and he hated it. That evening, I met Tessa in the clubhouse office for a brief procedural check-in, because the follow-up meeting notice had her name attached to it, and I wanted to make sure the process was clean. I didn't go alone because I wanted protection. I went alone because I didn't want it to look like a campaign. She greeted me with the same neutral professionalism as before, but I could sense she was more alert now. She had seen enough meetings to recognize when a chair was trying to turn policy into a personal weapon. She said, without emotion, that she had received concerns about the minutes and that those concerns were being handled through formal review. She didn't name Grant, but she didn't have to. She also said, in the same measured tone, that the minutes posted were backed up and that any revisions would be versioned. Versioned. That single word mattered more than any reassurance she could offer. Versioning meant any attempt to change the record would leave a trail. I thanked her and left. In the lobby, my phone buzzed again with a new text from Evelyn, and this one finally revealed what she had been building toward all along. She told me she had talked to someone about my behavior, and she suggested I should be careful because people were starting to see me differently. It wasn't an apology. It was a threat wrapped in concern. It also aligned perfectly with the draft I had discovered, the pre-written narrative she could now share with the right people. I didn't respond. I just stared at the message until the anger tried to rise and I pushed it back down. Anger would make me loud. Loud would make her narrative plausible. I wasn't going to help her. Instead, I added a new line to my ledger. Wife implies reputational escalation, post-meeting, tied to drafted narrative. Then I placed the phone face down and sat in silence. Because the next move was obvious now. They weren't trying to win the marriage. They were trying to win the crowd. And the only way to beat a crowd that feeds on stories is to give the crowd a record so clean, so dull, and so undeniable that repeating the lie starts to feel embarrassing. The follow-up meeting was coming, and Grant wouldn't be able to hide behind vague concerns again, not after the minutes made him look like a man who tried to punish without proof. He would need a new tactic, which meant he would need a new mistake, and if I was right, he was about to make it in a room where a secretary's cursor was already waiting to type one line that would end this without raising my voice. The follow-up meeting happened 3 days later, and the room was fuller, not because people cared about compliance, but because people sense blood when a narrative starts slipping. Grant arrived early and tried to control the space with friendly handshakes, but his smile looked strained, like he had been practicing it in a mirror that didn't forgive him. Evelyn came in last, dressed for sympathy, and she chose a seat where she could be seen without being cornered, because she wanted the room to watch her, not question her. Tessa opened the session by stating that the purpose was narrow, that any claims needed dates, times, witnesses, and policy lines, and that the minutes would reflect what was said without interpretation. Grant tried to speak first, pushing a complaint that still had no specifics, and when Tessa asked again for one dated incident, he deflected toward community discomfort and professional standards. That was when I placed one clear sleeve on the front table, not a stack, not an ambush, just one page, and I asked the chair to confirm whether late-night visitor patterns were part of the community concern, since the board had been invoking hallway standards. The still frame showed my doorway, a timestamp, and 2 silhouettes close enough to remove doubt without offering a face to argue about. Evelyn's breath caught, and Grant's jaw tightened, and the room did that quiet, collective calculation people do when they realize they've been used. Tessa asked Grant directly whether he had been present at my unit on that date and time, because the claim now touched conflict of interest and credibility. Grant tried to deny without committing, but the denial fell apart when Mara, the secretary, stated that the minutes would record refusal to answer clearly if he avoided the question. Evelyn tried to redirect the room toward my coldness again, but Tessa refused, saying this meeting was about documented conduct and board integrity, not marriage feelings. Grant finally admitted he had been in the building after hours for a personal matter, and that single phrase was enough to make the room understand the rest without me saying it. Tessa called for a recess, then returned and placed a conflict of interest disclosure motion on the table, noting that evidence had been received and that any further chair actions would be reviewed. Grant's allies stayed silent, because silence is what cowards choose when the record starts typing. Evelyn stared at her hands, not crying, not performing, because this time the audience had proof instead of pity, and pity doesn't survive timestamps. When the recess ended, the room felt colder, not from the air, but from the way certainty drains the warmth out of gossip. Tessa didn't raise her voice, and she didn't look pleased, because competent facilitators don't celebrate outcomes, they document them. She stated that the board could not proceed with any oversight motion while a conflict of interest question hung over the chair, and she instructed Mara to type the sequence of events into the minutes as it happened, including the evidence sleeve being received, the direct question asked, and the chair's admission of being present at my unit after hours for a personal matter. Grant attempted to regain control by framing his presence as harmless and by accusing me of weaponizing privacy, but Tessa cut that angle off immediately, reminding him that he had called the meeting on hallway standards and resident welfare, which made his own late-night presence relevant. Evelyn tried to speak again, reaching for the familiar language about fear and emotional safety, but the room no longer accepted soft adjectives as proof, and even the residents who had arrived hungry for drama now looked embarrassed by how thin her script sounded. The shift was visible in small things, like people looking down at their phones to avoid meeting her eyes, like a neighbor who had defended her earlier suddenly sitting straighter as if to distance themselves from being associated with the lie. Tessa then implemented the final move that made everything irreversible without turning it into spectacle. She asked for a formal conflict of interest disclosure on record, and when Grant hesitated, she stated that hesitation would be recorded as well. Then she placed the disclosure form on the table and asked him to sign it or refuse it in front of witnesses. He refused, choosing dignity over accountability, which is the predictable choice of men who think reputation is earned by posture. Mara typed the refusal into the minutes in real time, and that one line did more damage than any insult I could have thrown. Tessa followed by calling for a vote of confidence in the chair to be held at the next scheduled session, citing the received evidence and the integrity concerns. Then she ended the meeting with a reminder that official minutes were versioned and publicly posted. I didn't say anything heroic. I simply stood, collected my folder, and walked out while the room stayed quiet, because the humiliation was not a speech. It was the silence that followed documented truth. Outside in the hallway, Evelyn stepped toward me like she wanted to resurrect the old dynamic, and I looked at her once and asked the only question that still mattered, not as a threat, but as a verdict. Who are you?